The next topic is attention. So we demonstrated through an experiment that was done at Harvard University, the door experiment, where a person was asking somebody else directions, and then a door came through. And then the person who was asking directions would switch personality, or would switch with a different person, and majority of people who were giving directions wouldn't notice that the person had switched. And this is meant to demonstrate that attention is really essential, that even if you are directly looking at something and engaging with it, if your neural processes are engaged elsewhere, you can actually not really process that information. And this is based on what we've been learning about all semester, the fact that there's actually a great deal of work that your brain needs to do in order to process visual information. And in absence of that processing, if that processing is being devoted to something else, like giving directions, you can miss a great deal of information. And we talked about two types of these kinds of attentional deficits. One we've already mentioned earlier, which is change blindness, and inattentional blindness is a more blanket term for the fact that you can miss major components of what's going on without the allocation of attention. So this generally can be concluded that even though we have the impression that we're seeing everything all at once, in fact we're wrong, that unless we can directly look at certain things and devote attention to them, there's a great deal that we're not able to see because we don't have the neural resources to process everything. So why do we need attention? And as I just said, input has to be processed, but there's too much information to process all of it, and so the retina contains 100 million photoreceptors each eye, and that information is needs to be winnowed down and filtered because there's a bottleneck. We can't process all of that information, and therefore attention has to be allocated so that we process what we need to process in a given time period or given a certain task. We simply can't process all of it. And this leads to the metaphor of attention as a filter. Sensory input comes in, there's a huge amount of sensory input, but not all of it can make its way through to processing, so there's a filter in between. So how do we allocate attention? We can specify two types of ways attention can be allocated. Endogenous, which means top-down, driven by internal voluntary processes. So this is what you can decide to do voluntarily. You can move your attention to some part of the room. You can drive your attention to pay attention to these words here, or perhaps in the auditory domain, you're paying attention to my voice right now. So these are endogenous, and exogenous is bottom-up. It's driven by the stimuli themselves. So a flashing light or something very interesting in the visual scene is going to be exogenous. It's driven by the stimulus itself, not based on the goals or intentions of the person who's paying attention. A major component of how we pay attention in the visual domain is through eye movements. And eye movements, specifically saccades, which are these voluntary eye movements, you can move your eyes around in this jerky kind of fashion, are the fastest movement produced by the human body. Take about 200 milliseconds to initiate and 20 to 200 milliseconds to execute. So you need to plan the eye movements. We mentioned earlier in the semester the superior colliculus is very involved in programming and executing eye movements. And then they take some time to initiate, depending on how long, they take too long to execute, depending on how far your eyes have to move. So to move your eyes all the way across your visual field could take up to 200 milliseconds. Now, eye movements aren't the same as attention. You can move your eyes around, and you can generally, where you're moving your eyes is where you're paying attention. But covert attention can occur as well. So you can be staring at this point over here and paying attention to something that's down here. So what we really mean by attention is how much neural processing you're devoting, and so you can actually pay attention to something even where it's not you're fixating. However, generally these are very strongly coupled. So people have studied eye movements, and one thing we know is that all else being equal, there are strong bottom-up cues to eye movements. So this is a saliency map of this image here, and the saliency map is based on low-level cues such as changes in color, luminance, and motion. You can calculate this thing. You can actually, there are algorithms for figuring out where the salient regions are. And so it's places where there are changes in the image. And changes, of course, indicate that something interesting may be going on. There's not much going on up here in this blue sky, and there's not much going on here down in the road, but bam, here's a car, and here's a car, and that may produce a very strong attractor in this saliency map. And that stands to reason that if we're moving our eyes around, we're going to be moving our eyes to places where there's likely to be some action going on. However, if you look at richer natural scenes and you look at where people are performing tasks, it's clear that bottom-up cues don't tell the whole story about where people move their eyes. So people look at expected locations, for instance, searching for specific objects. Let's say you're told to look for a pot, you might look at the stove. And that's not driven just by saliency. So saliency isn't going to predict that you're necessarily going to look in this region. It doesn't mean that there's something bright or colorful here. You actually have expectations based on your knowledge of the way that certain kinds of scenes are structured. And so you might have knowledge about how kitchens are structured. So you're going to look in this area, look for maybe a stove area, and then look on that stove. And people fixate longer on semantically unexpected objects. So your eye movements are also driven by what you find. So if you find something that's unexpected, you might spend a little more time in that region. So this means that there's top-down contributors to eye movements as well. If we look at somebody who's performing a task, what you can see is that task actually guides where eye movements are going, not just when you're looking for, just looking around for something, but in terms of the operations you're going to carry out. So if you're making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, for instance, then you're going to find that people's eye movements are actually going to be predictive of where they're acting. So eye movements would tend to go briefly, fixate on the region where you're about to engage and produce a behavior. And so eye movements are very dependent not only on what's salient and where things might be expected, but also based on task. So what can we attend to? We discussed three things: locations, properties, and objects. These are three things that you can pay attention to based on the evidence. Location, when we talk about the idea that you can pay attention to a location, what we mean is that even in the absence of any particular stimulus, you can actually pay attention to some sort of region in the visual field. And this was shown famously by Poser in 1978. He had subjects fixate on a specific fixation in the center, and then they saw a cue that told them where a target was likely to be. Now, the participants held fixation throughout the trial. They didn't move their eyes. So the actual physical stimulus was the same regardless of where the target eventually ended up. They didn't move their eyes in one direction or another. Instead, they simply moved their attention. So what would happen is they saw fixation, the cue would come up, and that would tell them where the object was likely, where the target was likely to be, and then they had to as quickly as possible, respond to the presence of a target. And there were valid and invalid trials. On valid trials, the target appeared in the location where they were cued, where they were told. So 80% of the time, that's where the target appeared. So that was a good place to pay attention to. And on invalid trials, the target appeared in the location that was on the opposite side of where they had been cued. And what was found in this is that on invalid trials, it took people longer to respond to the target than it did on the valid trials. And this may seem fairly intuitive, but it's the first experiment that showed that even in the absence of an eye movement, and even in the absence of any particular feature in the scene, attention, simply knowing that an object would appear in a location, allowed people to process information from an expected location. And this demonstrates that attention actually is an engagement where there's a case where you're engaging in more intensive processing of a particular location. So it shows that you can sort of stare at the screen somewhere and be paying attention somewhere out over here in a kind of covert attention kind of fashion, and that you're doing something there that allows you, that you can actually measure an actual difference in response time if something is presented to that region. There's also evidence we could pay attention to properties such as color. Franklini and Egath had people repeat letters of one color or ignore numbers. So, for instance, they had to repeat all of the black letters and ignore the numbers, or the red letters and ignore the numbers. And what they found was that people were able to completely ignore the distractors from the other colors. So if they have to report the black letters, the fact that they are red numbers in this case wouldn't interfere, but the fact that there were black, that they repeat the black letters, the fact that there were black numbers would interfere. So that suggests that they're able to basically essentially filter out the color that they weren't interested in paying attention to. So it suggests that you can pay attention to a feature such as color. Intended to specific objects, Eglin et al. Showed evidence that people could pay attention to objects, not just locations or colors or features. So they did a Posner queuing task. So in this case, they would give a queue, and like Posner, there would be a valid or invalid queue. And what they found was that in the cases on invalid trials, so let's say they gave the queue here and the target was here, or the target could be here, people were faster to respond when the target appeared within the same object that they had been queued to than when it appeared in the opposite object, even though it was the same distance away. And so that suggested that attention actually spreads to the object. When you're paying attention up here, attention actually spreads to the rest of the object, and therefore you're quicker at detecting this location than detecting this location. What does attention do? So James famously said that it gives accent and emphasis to a region, and Carrasco et al. Found that this was actually measurable. What they did was have people fixate and then gave them a cue as to where a target was likely to occur. And what they had to do was judge which of these gratings was a higher contrast. And so was it the right or the left? And what they found is that if they were first given some sort of exogenous cue to pay attention to one location or another, then the grading that appeared in that location actually appeared like it had higher contrast than it really did. So they would rate a grading that appeared in the attended region as having higher contrast. And so this suggests that the addition of neural processing due to attention actually enhances the stimulus. It makes it look sharper, it makes it look more clear and enhanced. So what else does attention do besides enhancing the stimulus? One proposal has been that attention is essential for something called solving the binding problem. So there's different parts of our brain that process different aspects of a scene. If a ball is rolling down a plane, you have to process depth information, form information, location information, and as we know, there are different parts of the brain that seem to process this information. And so the question is, how does this all get combined together so we have a unified and an integrated stimulus? So feature integration theory suggests that attention is what is needed as the glue that allows us to integrate different features into a single object. A couple of sources of evidence for feature integration theory are visual search and illusory conjunctions, and we discussed these a bit. So single feature search is a case where you have to look for a target that's defined by a single feature. So for instance, a red X amongst black X's. And what happens is if you have to look for a red X amongst black X's, it doesn't matter how many black X's there are, so even if their set size is really large, performance is very quick. People respond are able to detect the red X amongst the black X's very quickly. Or, for instance, something defined by shape. So an O amongst a bunch of X's. People will be very quick at doing that as well. And this is called single feature search. The challenging case is conjunction search. So let's say you have to look for a red X amongst green O's and amongst green X's and red O's. So a red X amongst green X's and red O's. So in this case, the color isn't going to give you the right answer, and the shape isn't going to give you the right answer. You need both the color and the shape in order to determine what's the target. And what we find there is that the larger the set size, the longer it takes to search for it. And the interpretation of that is you have to search through each object and decide whether it in fact matches the target you're looking for. Here's something red, is it an X? Here's another thing that's red, is it an X? Or you can search, here's an O, is it the right color? And so in both cases, what you have to do is serially search through all of the objects in a way until you find the target, if the target is present in the search task. And so this idea is that in order to find a conjunction of features, so a red X specifically, amongst a bunch of red distractors and a bunch of X distractors, it's going to be difficult, and you're going to have to search serially and look at each thing in order to determine where the conjunction of features is. As we said, this is what makes it difficult to find your car in a crowded parking lot because you need to find the conjunction of both shape and color. And so you have to look at each individual car in order to find those conjunctions. Illusory conjunctions, we showed examples such as this one, where you have to report the numbers on the side and then the colors of the letters. And what happens in this case, in about 33% of the time, some people make an illusory conjunction. They'll see a green O or a blue T, and they'll report that that's what was there. And the idea is that because you didn't have time to pay attention because it's too quick, you pick up the individual colors and individual shape features, but the combination can be incorrect. Where does attention happen? So there's no single place where attention takes place. Attention seems to be tied to the specific task that you're doing. So orienting executive, you're going to have different kinds of so if you have to just determine where something is, you might you might use your orienting, which can be located in various different locations. So if you're orienting towards something, if you're making executive tasks, so you're trying to not pay attention to something, pay attention to one thing and not the other. That's executive. So it's very widely distributed across the brain. Attention has been seen in a single cell kind of apparatus or experiment. In this case, they're recording from a monkey, and the monkey would fixate in one location, and then a stimulus would come up, and the monkey was trained not to look at the stimulus. So it's just a question of where the monkey's paying attention. And what they found is that if there's a task that gives them a reason to pay attention to location, you're going to get very different response. You get an enhanced response in this region than when there's just a fixation. So if you just have to fixate there and the light comes on, if the monkey's not given a task to do in this region over here, then this neuron doesn't respond very rigorously. But here's this neuron whose receptive field is out here, and they're given a task. So when they're told to fixate here, and then the light comes on, what you see is before that light comes on, there's an enhancement of activity of that neuron. It looks like it's firing and it's getting ready, in a certain sense, to process the information from that location. Finally, we discussed some deficits of attention. Balan syndrome is the inability to fixate on individual items and can lead to illusory conjunction. So this is where people are not actually able to attend to a specific object. And as I said, it can lead to illusory conjunctions because without attention, you can't necessarily determine which features go together. So there can be a red thing, a red ball out there, and a blue box, and people with Balan syndrome may see a red box because they're not able to pay attention to the ball and determine that it has both a shape and color. Simultagnosia is the inability to perceive more than one object at a time, and sometimes it's thought of as sticky attention. So somebody with simultagnosia who's looking at this scene here may see the pyramid and may see this thing here, which is supposed to be the sun, but they may not know that this is an entire scene of the Egyptian pyramids because they just see one thing at a time. And in this case for here, they might just see the hammer, or they might see the flower, but they might not notice that there are other objects here as well. And visual neglect, which we saw a video of some time back, is the case where people with visual neglect will only respond to one hemifield. So they may see everything on the right side and respond to everything on the right side, but completely ignore what's ever on the left side of their vision, unless their attention is specifically brought towards it. It can almost look like they're blind to it, but then if they're directed to it and then told that they are neglecting this, they can actually see it. So it really seems to be fundamentally a problem of attention. Finally, we talked about that autism has some characteristic types of attentional differences. So viewers with autism, when looking at a movie, whereas a typically developing viewer without autism may look at the eyes here because this person is surprised and is showing surprise, and it's an important visually informative region. The autistic viewers will tend to look more at things that are not driven by those kind of top-down considerations about people's expectations or facial expressions, but rather may look at salient regions just based, so here's like an edge, strong edge, or something like that, and they will not look at the regions that carry the kind of emotional and interpersonal information. The final topic was perception and cognition. So this deals with some areas of research where the boundaries between what we think of as perception and cognition start to become a bit blurred. So where does visual perception end and other cognition begin? As we know, visual processing begins in the occipital lobe, but the occipital lobe is integrated with the rest of the brain, and there are many other areas of the brain that end up both using information from vision and also sending information to our visual processing. So we're going to discuss several of those topics which uh, enhance or highlight the way that vision can interact with other kinds of areas. So here are some topics that seem to blur these boundaries: aesthetics, language and perception, and multisensory processing. The first topic we discussed was physical attractiveness, which is quite a rich area of research in visual perception. What makes someone more or less attractive? And there are, of course, very different perspectives on this: nature, nurture, individual preferences. And as we pointed out from the beginning, it's clear that although there are cultural differences, there's quite a bit of agreement, and studies have shown there's quite a bit of agreement in terms of preferences that people have for certain kinds of characteristics. And so we discussed some of those characteristics. One of them is facial symmetry. All other things being equal, people will tend to favor symmetrical faces and consider them more attractive than asymmetrical faces. So this is a symmetrical face and this is a non-symmetrical face, and people tend to rate this as more attractive than that. Not only humans, but zebra finches also prefer symmetry, so it seems to be something very basic and potentially something we could think of as being having more of a nature kind of element to it. It doesn't depend on culture or societal factors. It seems to be something that's really basic, kind of a physiological constant across different species. Another feature is averageness. So if you take some faces and combine them and end up with an average face, that will generally be more viewed as more attractive than either of the individual faces. And so what we're doing here is morphing faces together. And so averageness seems to be generally more attractive. Part of that has to do with the fact that certain kinds of features tend to get smoothed over. So if we look at this example of some Miss Germany's contestants and the actual real Miss Germany versus an average composite of all these Miss Germanys, this is generally viewed as more attractive than even the real Miss Germany or any of these other contestants. Well, part of that is, as you can see, is the smoothing out of features. So kind of lines and wrinkles that show up in everybody's faces are kind of smoothed out here. But there's something about the facial structure as well, which seems to make an average face more attractive. This is not only because of average faces tend to be more symmetrical. That generally would be true if you take faces that are frontal, average them together, you're going to get faces that are more symmetrical because any differences, asymmetries are going to get balanced out by the opposite asymmetry in other faces. But Valentin et al. Looked at cases where the faces were done in profile and found that average faces were considered more attractive than the originals and also anti-averaged. So there's anti-morph faces. If you go in the opposite direction and enhance differences, that becomes even less attractive. So the conclusion is not just about symmetry. So why are average faces attractive? So there's a basic concept from evolutionary thinking of koinophilia that in general common traits are favored because they've been successful in natural selection. If there's a lot of it, then it must be a good thing, and therefore averageness is can be seen as attractive, perhaps because it shows that this is features that are shared across lots of individuals. If somebody has a very distinctive nose or very distinctive lips or something along those lines, that means that those are not average and therefore they're not common. And so the lack of commonness, in a certain sense, can be seen as indicating that this is not such a favorite trait. Is preference for attractiveness learned or innate? Well, we've seen studies that indicate that there seems to be a preference from very early on. So Slater et al. Looked at babies from 14, so less than a day old, to 150 hours, and they found that they looked longer at attractive faces. Now, does this mean that babies come hardwired with some specific idea of what's attractive? Bear in mind that babies have very poor spatial resolution in terms of higher frequency. They're probably not picking up on fine details of skin or specific features, probably something more coarse. It could depend on something like symmetry, for instance. Um, but even if we see a very early kind of preference, it doesn't mean that the babies aren't taking into account some of their early experience. They could be doing some quick averaging, for instance, and finding the average face, and that could be the one that's attractive, could be the one that's more average compared to the others. Another cue to attractiveness is sexual dimorphism. So males tend to have certain kinds of characteristics: broad forehead, prominent chin, chiseled jaw, and females tend to have the opposite. And this is due to the influence of testosterone both in the in utero and also during development. And so masculinized males and feminized females would tend to be more attractive, and feminized males and masculinized females would tend to be seen as less attractive. And this might be because it indicates exposure to gender-specific hormones during development, and it does, in the sense that this is a pretty strong cue that if you have a masculine male, that there was a good healthy dose of testosterone during development, and it's a potential sign of fertility. Interesting, women show highest preference when they themselves are fertile. They're going to have a stronger preference for a very masculinized male. So again, it locks into this sort of evolutionary story that this is a cue fertility, and this is a time when women themselves are fertile, that they're going to seek out a more masculine face that may indicate fertility. Another cue is youthfulness, and particularly this has been studied more in ratings of women, or has been found more in women and in men's judgment of attractiveness of women. Youthfulness is generally up to a point is seen as being attractive. As long as it's the age of fertility, youthfulness is generally going to be seen as more attractive. And the maximally attractive age, interestingly, is 24.8 years old, which is close to optimal fertility. So youthfulness may just be, again, another cue to fertility, and the idea is, from an evolutionary standpoint, that this is a sign of that this is somebody who has a high chance of reproductive success. We next move to the question of whether language influences other forms of cognition, and particularly whether language can influence perception. And we discuss this up here: Whorf hypothesis, which suggests that how we perceive the world is directly impacted by our language. So when we see, how much of what we see is dependent on our language and our culture, and so on and so forth. So the Whorfian hypothesis suggests that it's highly dependent. And we talked about some evidence for this, that coming from the literature about color, some studies have shown that depending on the language you speak, if you have differentiation between different colors, that can actually make you potentially perceive those colors differently. So in a study comparing Russians and non-Russian speakers and English speakers, Russian has two different words for dark blue and light blue, and the task here was to simply decide which one of these two squares is the same as the top square. What they found is that if these two bottom squares cross a color boundary in terms of the name, then Winower et al. Found that the Russians were able to do this task more quickly than people who don't speak Russian. So this crossing of the color boundary suggests is that the fact that they have a different name for this color, in this case, it's allowing them to judge this as being more different. And perhaps the idea is that it really truly looks more different, that the color looks more different. An even more compelling case comes from Adelson et al. Looked at the Himba tribe, what we saw a video of. So Himba have fewer color terms than we do, and in fact, in a case such as this one, they will see this blue color here as having the same name as these green colors. And what the study found was that in a test such as this one, where there's a different green, I think it's this one, than the rest, the Himba have a different name for this green and this green, and they're able to spot this difference very quickly. Whereas here, because the blue has the same name as these greens, to us have two different names, but to the Himba these would both be, I suppose, I don't know the name for it, but these have the same color name, and therefore they found this task hard. As we saw in the video, it was hard for the Himba to differentiate between this square and the other squares around us, whereas for us this is trivially easy. And for the himba, it was easy to see this was different than the rest of these, and for us, this is very difficult. And so the idea again is to suggest that the fact that they have different names for these two greens makes them see these more. They actually appear more different to them, and the fact that we have different names for this blue and green, we see these as very different, whereas the himba do not. An alternative theory that we discussed is perhaps that their language actually follows their perception, that something about their physiology actually makes them see these as more differently and these less differently, and then the reason they have different names for these cases and not this case is because of how they see it. But this is often taken by people to suggest this kind of linguistic relativism, this idea that the language actually affects the way perception works. And finally, we discuss multisensory perception, which is based on the question of whether vision operates independently of the other senses, and recent evidence that, in fact, the brain is highly interconnected. That neurons show modulation from other modalities. For instance, if we talk about a visual area, V1 and V2, which we know are strongly visual, that's the first region of the cortex that processes visual information. They're primarily processing visual information. However, they modulate by auditory information. So, if you play a certain sound, you can actually change the response characteristic of a certain neuron in these regions. In general, when we say that they're multisensory, we're talking about modulation. You're not going to find that sounds are going to make a V1 neuron fire, but playing a certain sound could change the response of a V1 neuron as it responds to a visual stimulus. And there are other multisensory areas as well. There are auditory, visual, and somatosensory areas. There are auditory and somatosensory, and so that this map shows that there's a great deal of the brain, and we're discovering more every day, that contain multisensory neurons. From a behavioral standpoint, we discussed two different illusions. The double flash illusion, which is a case where if you quickly show a single flash of light, so a spot that flashes once, and then play a double beep sound, so a beep beep sound at the same time you show a single flash, people often have the experience of seeing two flashes. And so the perceived frequency of a visual stimulus is influenced by an auditory stimulus in this case. So this is a case where vision is affected by audition. We also talked about the stream versus bounce illusion, where two dots that are passed through an occluder and then come out the other end, if there's a beeping sound that sounds kind of like a collision when they reach the central region, that will often be perceived as if the two are bouncing off each other, whereas if there's no sound, they'll be perceived as streaming past each other. And so again, this is a case where the auditory stimulus affects vision. We also discussed the McGurk effect, which is the opposite. This is a case where vision affects audition. So the McGurk effect occurs when there's a recording of one sound, so an auditory recording of one sound, in the case that we talked about in class, in the most famous example, there's a recording of the sound ba, but there's a video of somebody making a different sound, and so the lips are saying ga. And what will happen is, in many cases, most people will hear neither ba or ga. They won't actually hear the ba that their ears are in a certain sense detecting, but their brain will interpret the combination as some new sound, something along the lines of da. As the McGurk effect demonstrates that vision can actually influence audition. If you close your eyes, then generally you will hear the sound ba, but with your eyes open, you'll hear da. And the final topic we discussed in the class is something called the mind-body problem, which is the basic question of how can experience, which seems like a mental event, experience of redness or greenness or whatever kind of experience we're having internally, how can it be explained by objective neural processes? So we briefly mentioned that there are three different perspectives on this: materialism, idealism, and dualism. Materialism states that there's only one kind of thing, physical brain and body. Idealism says that there's only a mind, there's no such thing as the physical world. And dualism, which suggests that there are both kinds of substances in the world, mind and matter. We didn't really discuss this much in class, so we're just going to quickly pass by. So the basic idea of the scientific perspective is that when we smell a cup of chicken soup like this one, that the sense of the smell of chicken soup itself can ultimately be explained in terms of processes that are taking place in the brain. Some pattern of firing within our brain. And that is certainly a strong perspective, and we can think of this as a materialist perspective, that that's all that smelling chicken soup is. However, some have suggested, some philosophers have suggested, and some neuroscientists agree that there seems to be something missing from this story. We discussed the case of Mary's Room, which is a thought experiment. Mary being a fictional scientist who studies color, but has never actually seen color. So she lives in a black and white world. So she understands wavelengths, she understands transduction, cones, and all of the things that go into producing color responses. And she understands how the brain then processes that information and even produces a behavioral response, such as red or green or blue. But she has never seen color. And then she receives one day in the mail, she gets an apple. And she opens up the apple, and lo and behold, she sees color. And the impression that many people have, and again, it's just a thought experiment, sometimes called an intuition pump. It kind of gives you the intuition. No matter how much she understands the physiology, she doesn't really know what red means. And some people have proposed that this is a level that the internal experience of red is something that simply can't be understood by looking at and understanding physiological processes. Inverted qualia problem is the dilemma of knowing how does anyone know that the way they see red and green is the way anybody else sees red and green. So perhaps my red and my green are flipped in your mind. So the thing that I call red, you actually see and looks like my experience of green, and the thing that I call green, perhaps you have the experience that I have of red, and we just both I call this red and you call this green. I'm sorry, I call this red and I call this green, and you use those same names, those same color terms, but are having the exact opposite experience. So the point here is not to suggest that this in fact is the case, but rather that it seems as if there is some logical possibility that this might be true, in which case it suggests that just the color names and the physiology doesn't capture it, because the point is we could understand everything about our different brains and how they operate, but we could seem to still have a question about whether we're seeing red and green the same way. So it seems like there's something additional beyond the physiology that we can't quite understand. So finally, we ask this question: can perception be understood based on physiological brain processes? As we make more sophisticated artificial systems that can do vision, will they have subjective visual experience? And the answer is that we don't know the answer to this, and perhaps we never will. There are some things that seem somewhat unapproachable by scientific methods alone. Some people have strong faith that the materialist kind of perspective is the correct one, and that ultimately we'll have all these answers, and some people think not.